Good evening. Welcome to Chicago Public Library. I'm Jennifer Lezek with the Cultural, Civic, and Literary Engagement Team in the Adult Services Department. And on behalf of everyone here at Chicago Public Library, welcome. Before we begin, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. Tonight's event is also being live streamed on CPL's YouTube and Facebook channels and will be available for on-demand viewing immediately following the event. So tell a friend who couldn't make it. After the conversation, our guests will take a few questions from the audience from those who line up at the microphone in the front of the stage only. And virtual viewers, please put your questions in the chat or follow the directions to send them, which we'll give you shortly. Tonight, we are so thrilled to renew our partnership with a wonderful Chicago organization that's been a friend of CPL for many years, the Chicago Council on Science and Technology. Through their innovative programming, we are all able to learn, dream, and be inspired by science and technology. Tonight's event is a great example, and I can't wait to learn about the airplanes of our future. We are grateful to Chicago Council on Science and Technology for their partnership and for bringing this program to CPL. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Kylie Kozlik, Manager of Programs and Internships at C2ST.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all. I am Kylie. I will be the moderator for today. For those of you who are new to the Chicago Council on Science and Technology, or C2ST as it is often called, we are a 17-year-old nonprofit that seeks to inspire and engage all segments of society about science and technology and all of their contributions to society. We host free programming like this one, thank you all for coming out, throughout the year, both in person and virtually on our YouTube channel. We strive to be a reliable and accurate source of information, and we do that through this free public programming. We believe science is for everyone, so please consider donating to C2ST so we can continue to offer free programming and resources to Chicago and beyond. If you're interested about learning more, you can sign up to receive updates on upcoming programs at c2st.org, or there's a sign up for our newsletter out in the lobby. So thank you also to Harold Washington Library for this amazing space tonight. We're super excited to be here, and for all of the donors who helped bring this program to life. This event is part of a series that's funded by the Baum Family Foundation, and that's all about sharing relevant and exciting research on climate, energy, and the environment. So we're incredibly grateful to their support as they foster discussions driving innovation and progress in these very important areas. So for today, we will be using menti.com for some polls and the Q&A if you are joining us virtually. If you are in person, of course, you'll be able to come up to the mic and ask your question, but if you would prefer to submit your question through the Menti, that is fine as well. There'll be a QR code, oh, there it is, a QR code up on the screen so that you can get all hooked up into that. So with that, we'll kick off our amazing event, Electric Horizons, the Future of Sustainable Aviation. The aviation industry faces increased pressure to reduce its environmental impact, and we are witnessing really amazing advancements in areas such as electric batteries and sustainable aviation fuels. So our panelists today are here to share their insights into what the current state of sustainable aviation is, discuss what the potential of those future technologies are, and explore some of the obstacles that we're going to have to overcome to get widespread adoption of sustainable aviation. So we're super excited to hear from our awesome panelists today. So first up, we have Dominic Karbowski, manager of the Low Carbon Aviation Group for Eco-Mobility at Argonne National Laboratories. Dominic leads Argonne's research on electrified aviation and aircraft energy efficiency using advanced simulation methods. He has extensive experience in transportation, electrification, and optimization for energy efficiency. We also have Professor R. Eric Jones, who is a seasoned aviation expert with over 25 years of experience in aviation technical operations and education. He is a U.S. Navy veteran, worked with major commercial airlines, and has held multiple teaching positions in university aviation departments. We also have joining us Dr. Joseph Schweiterman, Schwieterman, the director of the Chaddock Institute and a professor at DePaul's Graduate School of Public Service. In addition, he is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Issues in Aviation Law and Policy, and he also spent several years at United Airlines. And then last but certainly not least, we have Pedro Ortiz Toral, and this is for you, sir. Perfect. Who is the Program Director of Bioenergy Carbon Management and Conversion at GTI Energy. Here in the United States, he works to advance breakthrough conversion technologies that contribute to the global energy transition. Over the last decade, he's focused on renewable processes to develop bioenergy, renewable products, and sustainable fuels. So welcome all of our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. So to set our stage and kind of ground us in where this field is at, we're going to start off with Pedro and Joe. Pedro's going to start us off with some information about kind of the landscape where we are at with sustainable energy. And then Joe is going to talk a little bit about how these innovations are happening here in Chicago specifically.
Okay, thank you, Kylie. I have a few slides today, but I wanted to start with a couple of thoughts. First of all, I wanted to speak about sustainability briefly, at the very least the way I look at sustainability. When I hear that word, I think of a couple of things. One is technology and innovation. The other one is environmental impacts, and then the third one is community impacts. And these are all three things that I concern myself with, as well as GTI Energy, the company that I work for, and the group that I work for. And this slide's going to help me start the topic, at least from my perspective, as in climate neutrality is determined by the energy source. So understanding that this forum was built around electric aviation, I wanted to bring up a couple of other ideas that will be important in bringing sustainability to the aviation sector. And this picture here illustrates one way we can do this, but not the only way, of course. So in this particular example, what I'm trying to show here is that there is a way to harness renewable electricity to produce synthetic fuels that can help us produce a SAF, a drop-in fuel for decarbonizing the aviation sector. Now, the idea here is that more or less we have a closed loop in carbon. This is what allows us to mitigate the greenhouse gas. So this here is a summary. This is some information that recently landed on my desk, and it compiles a number of scenarios for net zero energy economy as a whole. And there are some of these studies are US based, some of them are more global scenarios, but they point at one specific source or sector that's poised to grow, and that is the bioenergy source for energy. And that's economy-wide, not specific about aviation fuels, but in order for us to achieve net zero carbon as a civilization, bioenergy is going to play a key role in all of these different scenarios. And wherever we stand today when it comes to bioenergy, it would need to grow for us to meet those goals. So this picture here, though it's a bit outdated, it illustrates that of the entire energy portfolio of the US, it illustrates the greenhouse gas impacts. And we see transportation here is pretty big. It's probably hard to read, but transportation accounts for about 27 or roughly a third of all energy and carbon impacts from it. So this is a very important sector for us to address. And within that, of course, aviation plays a role. And close to the center here, what I'm trying to illustrate here is of all the traditional fuels, we can see where those fuels are utilized. in transportation. And then we see light-duty vehicles, we see trucks, we see rail, air, and marine. And my point here is that we can very easily talk about electrification of ground vehicles, but towards the bottom, we start looking at more difficult to decarbonize sectors. And the ones that I focus most on are air transport and marine. And these are the difficult to decarbonize sectors where we focus mostly when we think about bioenergy. So then the next picture on the right just basically illustrates, in the context of the US, how much biomass or waste can we harvest without ever touching food supply or create additional impacts outside of this. And these sources can replace, for instance, the current marine and air transport fuels. So it's not a problem of feedstock availability necessarily. It's more of a problem of technology. Okay, and speaking of technology, these technologies here are part of my portfolio at GTI of the technologies we're developing, and I've highlighted in blue the ones that have to do in some way with sustainable aviation fuels. But of course, there's some other areas. I was mentioning to the other panelists here that renewable propane, for instance, it's an emerging area of a lot of interest and investment. But certainly in the US, the focus within bioenergy is on SAF, and that's where the Department of Energy is putting most of the resources. And we also have things like the SAF Grand Challenge coming from the White House and its goals to decarbonize the aviation sector. And those are they're very ambitious goals, to put it lightly. And of all of those, SAF is the best near-term solution. I think that, with that, I'll hand over to Joe.
Oh, thank you. Thank you much. Great comments. I'm going to dovetail on your remarks. And I was so excited to present tonight because it's really a positive topic. You know, I spent a couple years at United Airlines early in my career, so I still get a lot of calls from the media. And 80% of the calls is, you know, say something bad about the airlines, their flights are canceled, or, you know, isn't our O'Hare terminals an embarrassment? And this topic, you know, we see Chicago is really taking a bit of a leadership role we can be pretty proud of. So what I'd like to do is just give you the landscape of how mobility changes for air travel are happening in Chicago and how sustainability features into that. And the first slide I'll just show you is that as Pedro's remarks said, we need something that existing planes can use to cut carbon emissions. The next generation of aircraft, that's great, electric, hydrogen, but we need something fast. And about 5 years ago, Scott Kirby at United felt guilty because most of what the airlines were doing were buying carbon offsets, where you spend money to save a bit of the rainforest or wooded land in the United States. And that's always been a little bit dubious if you really are offsetting carbon emissions because the measurement is so difficult as to what would have happened had you not made that investment. So Kirby said, we need to do that, but we also need to get in the game and prove that sustainable aviation fuel can work. So United's committed to buying a huge share of the country's stock, and their headquarters, you know, is right in downtown Chicago. And other airlines are picking up on that. I did learn in our talk beforehand. Now, propane fuel was another option, which sounds pretty exciting. But there's only so much we can get from this. I mean, you may cut emissions, and Pedro, you could comment, is it 30%? What the theoretical max is with sustainable aviation fuel, but it's 80% is the theoretical max. Long time before we get there. But maybe even that's not good enough because post-pandemic air travel demand is just shooting up again. And we'll probably set a record, not this year, but next year in flight travel. So the race is on to get this fixed because we know seats flown are going to continue to rise. Funny enough, where a lot of the excitement is coming is in really short hop flights. And a long time ago, as I featured in a book I did. We once had this air taxi system in Chicago, that these airports you see on the screen, long lost Meigs Field, which is worth a whole program in its own self sometime, but Valparaiso and Midway Airport and up north a bunch of heliports were all connected by these small planes and helicopter services. And so we had an air taxi service. It was all, of course, jet fuel driven. But when we opened the expressways, all of these dried up. And so we have no helicopter commercial service in Chicago now, and very little in the United States. So as we think of the future and what's coming next, I think there's two things I just want to point out. One, we're designing airports and moving fast to expand our airports. And O'Hare 21 is the big plan for O'Hare. And that was approved, but the airlines agreed to the terms just a few months ago. But you can see in white the massive expansion of Terminal 2, rebuilding Terminal 2 into the so-called Gateway Terminal, which you'll see there, as well as one satellite terminal and an expansion to Terminal 1. And the city agreed to drop the second satellite because the airlines were nervous about the costs. But I point this out just to show the incredible growth of air travel we're expecting, and for airlines to reduce carbon emissions with this kind of expansion is going to require really moving up that learning curve of sustainable aviation fuel fast, and to indeed modernize fleets so we can reduce this. But the exciting thing about this airport is they're really going to push the boundaries on sustainable design, electric ground handling equipment, innovative ways so those airplanes are using those jets as little as possible while taxiing, and lots of other green features. So this will be breaking ground pretty soon. I hope I'm still working when it's all done. It's going to take a while, but we are thinking probably by about 2029, 2030, this could all be up. So in the middle of this, we saw United really wanted to help technology companies with electric air travel, because we think short hop flights under 350 miles, we could see electric air travel quite in our lifetime. And so United has worked closely with a technology company we'll see called Archer to prototype, starting in 2025, air taxi service from our vertiport, which is by the Illinois Medical District, Cook County Hospital, to O'Hare. And it made a big splash, so to speak, because it's something we haven't seen since the 50s with helicopters, but this is very high-tech, zero-emission equipment. And with that, there's this company called Archer that's working with an operator to test this equipment, perhaps even later this year. You can see how this technology would look, have seats, I think, for about 6 or 8 people, but it's a real high-tech design, and it's exciting. Chicago is going to be the place where this happens. So the hope is, if this succeeds, and I don't think it needs to succeed commercially, if people don't use it to go to O'Hare, that'll be a shame, but if the technology works, we know that electric vertical aircraft that take off like a helicopter and then fly like an airplane with changing of the propulsion can pretty quickly get to, say, 12 to 15 seats. And after that, we maybe get to 20 to 25. And those short hop flights really could shift fast to electric if all this works here in Chicago. So I just want to do that as a setting before we start our Q&A. So thank you all.
All right. So thank you both very much. We're going to go into a little bit of a panel discussion here as we go. If you think of questions, you can, of course, save them to ask in person at the end, or throw them into the Menti, and we'll switch between in-person questions and those at the end. But I wanted to start off with a question to you, Eric. Why is all of this sustainable development, we touched on it a little, right? But why is it so important as, we see these growing amounts of aviation happening?
Well, look, sustainable fuels are going to be a big part of aviation going into the future. And I've been a part of a couple of industry advisory boards who have said that, it's not a matter of if, it's when. But more than that, airlines are going to need to make money, and the people who are flying those airplanes are starting to log hours with their credit cards. If they're not going to fly these products because they aren't sustainable, it's a business imperative, not just a moral or an ethical issue anymore. So airlines are really starting to pay attention. I think Joe did a great job of outlining one of those, which is Archer. Archer is a remarkable urban air mobility company. They were actually in business before United Airlines jumped on board. Billy Nolan, who is the ex-FAA administrator, is on that team as well. Joby is another company, very powerful company in this field. It's the amazing thing about this too is this urban air mobility. It's not just the technology is important, but the technology is only going to be important from 0 to maybe 100 miles. It's electric, a lot of autonomy, a lot of sophistication in these autonomy systems. But the full-blown transportation system, you're talking about transatlantic flight, that's going to take something more substantial that other individuals on the panel are working on. So, and that's a 2050 initiative. But the amount of carbon emissions now are just, it's too much. And it needs to be reduced, and the population has taken a note of it. And I'm really interested here, too, about how policymakers are addressing this issue for the short term and the long term, because that's really going to drive a lot of the sustainability issues.
Yeah. And Dominic, you do some of this work to look at the systems, the airplanes, and we know we have these short haul flights. Is it possible to get these big airplanes to be electric?
So everything is possible from an engineering and technology point of view, but you quickly reach the limits of things that are practical and feasible from a commercial point of view. So, for example, if you take batteries, one of the great advantages is that they're very heavy. It takes the energy contained in one pound of fuel is 40 times that of what is contained in 1 pound of a battery. So if you really want to have some range, you need to put a lot of battery. So that means you need to stretch your aircraft, which means, or you reduce your payload, so that becomes not feasible as much. But some of my colleagues in my team did analysis looking, let's say we get to 5 times current state of the art in battery technology in terms of how heavy they are or how much energy you can pack in 1 pound. Well, then we can get to interesting numbers, such as maybe a third of all the emissions or all the we call passenger miles. So a metric of how many passengers times the distance traveled. So 1/3 of that could be done electric, with that big step change in technology. So it's definitely something future looking. But that being said, we already have production planes that are all electric. Those are more trainer aircraft. You can purchase them. I think they're $200K, and people who fly them, they're really, really happy because they're silent and they don't vibrate as much. They're much cheaper in maintenance. So those exist, even though it's not really for air transport of passengers.
Okay, so you're looking at this in the future, right? As we look far, you're also looking at in the near term as well for those solutions. And I know that, Pedro, you are looking at solutions that can kind of happen right now. You mentioned something called drop-in. Can you explain a little bit of what it means to have something that you can drop into an airplane for sustainability?
Yes. So by definition, what we call SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel, is a drop-in fuel. It's not an alternative fuel. And the goal is, how do we replace the source for the fuel? So instead of talking crude oil, we're now talking waste. We're talking ag residue, forest residue, energy crops. But the fuel itself, it's chemically no different than what's currently being used, means that once we produce the fuel, the way to store it, transport it, and the end use, which would, in this case, impact the engines and even how the fuel is sold in the marketplace, that would all be the same. So when we say drop in, we change the way we make the fuel, but it has to have the same qualities, it has to be the same chemicals, the same molecules, basically, so that we don't have to change the entire value chain for the fuel. We simply change the way we make it. And to me, that is certainly the quickest way for us to achieve sustainability, but that doesn't mean that's the only way. It's certainly challenging, and I'm not looking at this issue as holistically as people like Dominic is looking at it, probably looking at it from every possible angle and trying to model these scenarios. My strategy is more short term. So how we decarbonize now or in the next 5 years rather than in 20 years? But that's not to say that there's other solutions that make a lot of sense, that are worth investing in today, and that there are people that are already working on those. I mean, we've heard some examples here.
And one of the great things too, we were talking about it in the green room prior to this, is look, there's lots of different solutions to this. I mean, I think that people are really scattergunning these shots, right? I mean, there's lots of different ways that engineers and the folks here can troubleshoot this. The biggest issue for us, for the industry, is that we model all of our stuff on trend analysis. In other words, all of the safety that we've built into the aviation ecosystem is essentially backward-looking data. We're able to look at what we've done over the last 60 years or 100 years, 60 years for commercial aviation, and we're able to build on that and build a safety record that is probably one of the best in the world, if not the best in the world. And now when you start introducing changes, whether it's a drop-in fuel, an SAF fuel, which I can tell you would be, from just an everyday operational tempo, would disrupt some things. You may get an engine gas temperature that rides just 5 or 10% higher in flight than what you would normally see with a fossil fuel. And that would cause one part, maybe an igniter in one of the engines, to start to erode faster. And that would create some sort of scenario that might be problematic, that might be dangerous. So the problem is not just from an engineering perspective, it's also from a culture perspective. We have to change the culture of how we fly and how we maintain, which is my field, of course, how we maintain these assets, but also how we fly them. And then the other part of this is also, what about the passengers who are getting on board these aircraft? If passengers are getting on the now you're going to pay more for fuel. I don't think anyone up here is going to say that SAFs are less expensive than the fuel that we spent, hundreds of years developing. Now you have to raise ticket prices, and that causes problems. And then you also got airlines that are held with stock from public people. Now they're going to lose money on some of their stocks. It really does disrupt a lot of things that we have long established in aviation, which is one of the reasons the policy piece is just really critical. The other piece that Pedro talked about too was the model that we have in the United States for incentivizing folks to invest is a carrot, right? So you invest some money in the stock market, and then that money is utilized to fund some research that's going on, and then you can make some money on that stock. And that traditionally has been very slow, and that policy changes, right? The policy changes, which then changes the stock every time there's an election cycle. Where in Europe, the model that they're utilizing is more of a stick model, right? Where look, you have this much time to make this change, or we're going to tax you at a higher rate. So all of that is being worked out over the course of, not just 2 or 3 years. This is a decades-long discussion that has to happen. So it's not just an engineering puzzle, right? I think that it's easy to focus on the engineering puzzle, but it's also a cultural puzzle. You're talking about mitigating people's freedom, essentially, if you start to tax at a higher rate and you start to raise those ticket prices. So it's really a multifaceted problem that aviation industry is dealing with. And one of the reasons why this work is so important.
Yeah. I do want to get to the policy and some of those questions, but before we jump there, I just wanted to ask Dominic, we've talked about like these drop-in SAF fuels, we've talked about, kind of electric batteries. Are there other types of alternates that are being looked at, or different methods that maybe aren't quite so fuel-focused that are being looked at?
Yes, but maybe before we get there, like we're just telling me in terms of sustainability and specifically on the emissions and specifically on the global warming effects. So currently aviation, it's about globally 2% of all the emissions in the world, 3% in the US. And if you look at all the transportation sector, it's 12%. And a lot of researchers think actually these effects are underestimated because it's when you burn these fuels up in the atmosphere, so you have of course some CO2 that's emitted, but you also have other chemicals such as NOx and water. A quarter of the emission is water, and that water in certain conditions can create clouds. Often you see these clouds, sometimes they just dissipate, but sometimes they stay. Those are called contrails, and these contrails are effectively, when they stay for several days, they create a warming effect. So there's a whole debate and whole range of studies on that specific topic. How much are these contributing to the warming effect? There's some analysis that shows it's like twice or up to 5 times what the current estimates of CO2. And so that's that starts becoming a very large effect. So just putting a little bit of a background on that. Mm-hmm. Going back to your questions in the technology and other, we mentioned SAF, of course. We have a lot of technology a little bit more focused on the maybe improvements to the current technologies, which means changing a little bit the aerodynamics. Some things are, for example, there's a new project that NASA is starting with Boeing. It's called a trussed wing aircraft. So basically putting instead of having your wings at the bottom, put them on top, making them slimmer, so that makes them more efficient. So there's less drag, so that's less fuel. That's one. There's research on lightweighting the materials. There's improvements still, forecast of improvements in engine technologies, adding gearboxes or other aspects. There's hybridization, so that means you still keep your engines, your jet fuel, but you add some electricity to it, so that can get you 5-10%. So all these technologies, they're in the single digits in terms of improvements. But then you start adding up these, and you start getting to the point where you can get decent amount of savings. If we could keep up with the past trend, right, from the 50s to nowadays, we reduced the emissions, the fuel use per unit of distance and passenger per seat by a factor of 5. Right? But unfortunately, the traffic went up 100 times, so that negates it. And then another potentially disruptive energy would be hydrogen. So it has interesting properties in terms of weight density. Unfortunately, it is large, takes lots of space on the aircraft, and it has a whole range of challenges. But nonetheless, it is actively researched a little bit more in Europe than here. Airbus, for example, is working on 3 different concepts that uses hydrogen with a mix of different technologies, and hydrogen can be either burned just like a jet fuel. I think the engine still needs to be adapted to properly function with hydrogen. Or in a fuel cell, which produces electricity, and it's a more efficient way of converting the chemical power into usable power and mechanical power and thrust, that property. the airplane.
Cool. Thank you for sharing. So when we talk about, we've got alternate fuel sources, and I know, Joe, you do some policy, some law stuff. What kind of changes would we see, say, Pedro's company finds a new fuel, right? Or we suddenly have, these taxis everywhere. What kinds of things can we, as like someone who I bought a ticket, kind of see?
Right. Yeah, great question. And your remarks, I thought of, right now, there aren't any, even in Europe, explicit policies to reward airlines for reducing carbon emissions. You pay a ticket tax when you buy your ticket. Airlines have committed to 2040 goals. They got to be mindful of that. But right now, there's 1 million consumers ready to buy a ticket, and there's airline executives planning their schedule for the fall, and they aren't rewarded for carbon savings in any meaningful way. And Europe has tried flight shaming, but it can get you so far, and it hasn't really been a thing here in the United States. So we really think in the short run, countries do need to have, and you can do it, some form of a carbon-related tax to create the right incentives. And Europe's experimenting with that. A few countries have added that. But you think of the immediate changes that would occur. Airlines fly these little regional jets, and they're much more carbon intensive than the larger planes. Some of them fly older jets. So if you fly Frontier or some other airlines, they have some older planes. And the incentive for them, of course, to modernize is to spend less on fuel, but the benefits to society are not only the savings on the fuel, but the carbon reductions. So we have to align that. And I think that really would set off lots of innovation. The big problem we have is consumers and taxpayers are carbon committed. They really like 2040 goals. They support the green agenda, but they say, don't tax me. And so the idea of a carbon tax on gasoline has been a non-starter. But I think things are starting to change with that, and we can only push the carrot so far with tax incentives for buying green and so forth. We have to integrate it into these everyday decisions. The exciting thing is that with this emerging technology, it creates all kind of interesting opportunities for airlines to receive tax credits for buying these smaller electric planes, using sustainable aviation fuel, some federal subsidies to start with that. I think right now, and you could maybe clarify, the cost of SAF is about 7-fold over regular jet fuel or something, but if we can get that margin down to, say, twice or 50% higher than conventional jet fuel, we can start to use subsidies or incentives for airlines to adopt it. So the policy world's complicated, but there are some exciting opportunities.
Yeah. And when, to Pedro, with these sustainable aviation fuels, when I don't know, you find one, right? You're like, ooh, I've found one that, fits the bill. What are those steps? What does it look like to go from, say, a lab to start seeing them in an airplane?
Okay. I feel pretty comfortable talking about the front end of that process, and I'll let somebody else comment on the back end of that process. On the front end of the process, what I look for is a technology that can get to those molecules economically, right? So mentioning the cost of SAF, and it really depends on what the resource is. Are you paying me to get your biomass or your resource, or am I paying you a price for it? That's very determining. And the other piece is the capital cost of the conversion. So it's basically a biorefinery, and that dominates the price. It's the capital cost of the plant to do the conversion of the resource into the fuel. Now, I can't give you an exact figure of what SAF wholesale price might be, but we are working towards making a parity with aviation fuel. That's the goal, and we get better at it. As we work more and more on refining the technologies or finding a better way to get to it, or a simpler way to get to the fuel, depending on the resource. So there's a lot going on there. Now, once I make the molecule in my lab in some meaningful quantity that I can analyze it and say, this looks like aviation fuel, there's a process of vetting that fuel, and we normally discuss them in terms of the way the industry looks at it. So there's these certification pathways. So each of the pathways to get to those, to the SAF, has to be certified to some extent. And there's at least 4 steps that I'm aware of. There's tier 1 to tier 4 of testing. And that's basically a way to communicate to the industry that this is, you're good to go. We can basically guarantee that this is it's a drop-in fuel and it's not gonna create a problem for you. And those steps are increasingly in complexity and cost. So it goes from basic chemical analysis, the tier 1, tier 2 are mostly analysis, and then you start going into engine testing and things of that sort. That's not cheap, and I'm not too familiar with that part of the process. I'm sure maybe others can comment.
Yeah, so maybe just an analogy, all right? So an analogy of maybe how an engine is tested, right? So there's thousands of hours of engineering that goes in, and I know Dominic's doing great work in simulation and modeling, which helps offset the time that it takes to develop a lot of those engines. For instance, there was the 777, which has been around for a long period of time. It's a Boeing product, super reliable airplane, 2 engines, which was fairly controversial at the time. We operated it under a FAA provision called ETOPS, Extended Twin Engine Operations, which means we were able to fly it from Los Angeles to Sydney on 2 engines. This is at a time when there was 4 engines in the 747 or the DC-10 at that time. But just the testing on that one engine that Boeing was, there was multiple engines, but the one that they were utilizing for that airplane was tested for years. In fact, they had brought it up for cold weather testing up to Alaska, and they had run that and the auxiliary power unit for a year of running the engine and pelting it with snow and ice and debris. And so that analogy, really tells you, one, imagine the cost associated with that. Imagine the risk. You're putting billions of dollars into the research and development of an article that may or may not pass that testing, or you'll have to augment your testing to make it successful, right? So it's a huge gamble. And it's one of the reasons that these aircraft manufacturers they're so big, right? They're large multinational companies. Many of them, for instance, Airbus we were talking about, they're, a lot of these are state-sponsored that are very connected to the economy of their nation state. So, but you need that level of security because if something does happen to that engine after it's tested, and something does happen with a SAF fuel that you put in, or a long-term asset like a hydrogen or electric propulsion asset, something does happen, then it's litigious. Then you're in the courts. Then if something does happen to family members, heaven forbid that there's a serious incident, it becomes cost prohibitive to even develop that product, which is why a lot of these companies fall to the wayside when they're competing against an Airbus or a Boeing for these. And these are large commercial jets, right? The ones that Joe was talking about were urban air mobility. These are very small companies that operate. They're very limber. They're able to navigate the certification process that Pedro was outlining with a great deal of success because they're doing it step by step by step. Which is counterintuitive to the way that we've developed airplanes previously. But they're having a great deal of success. So that's very encouraging to us as outsiders, or to me, watching this development process. That urban air mobility piece is going to be transformative. And even if we just glean technology from that, even if we just glean ancillary technologies from those processes going forward, it's a huge win for our industry. Those airplanes, Joby is operating at -4 decibels. They're super quiet. highly sophisticated navigation systems that they're going to be able to plug into the air traffic control system. Of course, there's a heavy debate about what that would look like. But if you can think about urban air mobility, and Joe did a great job outlining it, urban air mobility is something you're going to plug into the airspace below 15,000 feet. Right? So the battle for, who's got air superiority, whether it's United Airlines or American or Delta or Southwest, becomes moot, because now you've got these smaller carriers, these urban air mobility vehicles that are operating below that space. But they still have to go through all those engineering challenges that I just illustrated.
So just for those of us, so there's like the airspace up above, right, where all the big commercial airliners go, right? And then you're talking, there's an in-between space that's like not where the big commercial airlines, but where like drones, these air taxis will be. And then there's like, how close to my house is that like space, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you're absolutely correct, right? Airliners are going to operate above 25,000 feet. The goal to operate at that high altitude is airplanes are super efficient up there. They're designed to operate with that minimal amount of oxygen. They're above the weather, in spite of what we feel when we're getting knocked around in turbulence. But airplanes operate very smoothly. You can navigate very successfully at those high altitudes. The middle altitudes, those are traditionally reserved for regional jets who are on shorter hauls. They'll often go up to 15, 25,000 feet if they're just going from Chicago to South Bend or Chicago to Indianapolis. But that space that you're talking about, that helicopter space that has traditionally been very loud, there's been a lot of legislation that have kept people away from that space. Now that space is being looked at as a place to provide a market for people to get from point
So
A to point B.
quieter than the Air and Water Show.
Ideally quieter than the Air and Water Show. Yeah, hopefully your windows will not be broken. And there is a great video, and I'm sure you guys all have access to this, but there's a great video. Joby does a great job of documenting each one of their successful engineering tests. There's a great one of John Benvener, listening to his rotorcraft right behind him. You cannot hear it at all. It's remarkable, really remarkable.
So before we jump to audience questions, I kind of want to ask a question of each of you so we can just kind of go down the panel. And for you and from your perspective of where you sit, right, in the kind of field of aviation, what would you love to see, right? Like if you were like visioning, like I would love to see this happen. You don't have to give a timeline or anything like that, right? Because I know that's, hard, but, what would you love to see in the future of sustainable air travel? And we can start on the end.
That's a very tough question.
Yeah.
But I will, because of where I sit topically in this panel,
Yeah.
I will say what I would like to see is a point, and this is kind of realistic, hopefully, that we are starting to blend SAF with traditional fuels and get there fast. So halfway there, it's what I can picture in my mind, 50% blending of SAF with traditional fuels.
Yeah, this is a really hard question. I think what I look at is people's eyes gloss over when you say these technologies are coming because they've been hearing that their whole life, but it really is with us. I mean, I was in the airline industry, people said video conferencing is coming and business travel is going to be affected. This is like in the late 80s, and never happened. 90s go by, never happened. Then suddenly a pandemic happens and the whole world changes, and suddenly every teleconferencing option is out there. And I think that's going to happen with this new technology. And I think we have to make sure we are ready to use it responsibly as a country, so it doesn't simply, say, replace car trips or electric car trips, that you end up moving things to the air in this very capital intensive, in some ways carbon intensive when you look at the cost of making those vehicles and so forth. And that we're ready to think about high-speed rail and a role for air mobility that fits into a larger sustainability plan, and it doesn't just catch us off guard with technology suddenly changing the way we move out without aligning all those incentives.
Yeah, it's a great question, Kylie. Look, I use this really awkward, and if my students are in the audience or listening, they will absolutely roll their eyes when I say this. But look, there's many respects. When you look at technology, my hope is that in the future we're going to get on something, whether it's urban air mobility, whether it's a sustainable aviation fuel like hydrogen that's going to take me across the Atlantic Ocean. But I want to get on that technology as safely, as non-harmful for the environment as I do an elevator. So if you can imagine, I mean, people, they would not go on elevators at the turn of the century unless there was an elevator operator who was invested in the successful completion of that elevator going up and down. And there was elevator operators up until the 1960s who, I'm not getting on that elevator unless there's an elevator operator on there. And over the course of time, generations got used to that evolution of going up and down in an elevator, and I really believe that aviation is like that now. I mean, it used to be a big thing for people to go fly from point A to point B, and now I think it's a very common experience that the majority of the population of people are able to experience. And look, time is everything, right? We're on this planet for a very short period of time, depending on your age and your views, but if you can go from point A to point B safely and efficiently and see a family member who maybe is passing, or go to a family reunion where you haven't spent a lot of time with some family members, those experiences are truly resonant. Those are truly valuable things. And I'm very proud to be part of an industry, or was part of an industry, that was able to provide that asset and that experience to a host of different people.
Yeah, good points. And well, two things. As an engineer really in the field, like, what would be great is that some chemists find a magical battery that's like really, that transformed this phone batteries in this size to just that, right? So that would be great. More from a society point of view, I think looking at always the big pictures and making sure that these technologies are equitable, and we provide the services, the mobility services, to those who need, right? We don't, create more toys for the uber wealthy, but just make technology that people can use, and there's different ways, and maybe things that are even outside the aviation sectors that can help alleviate these problems as well.
Very cool. Yeah.
If I may, quick go back on that one. I've been thinking as we went through with that question, something that I would really like to see is the aviation industry getting a little more serious about developing the technologies that will take to get us where the public wants and where we all know that we can get to. And that's regardless of which technology or solution it is. I think this needs to be holistically supported, because I believe that there is not one solution that's going to solve all the problems. There's going to be some solutions that are going to be optimized for a certain problem. Say, we talked about urban transport, but we also talked about transatlantic air transport. So some of these perhaps will require different solutions. And I think we need to see the industry invest generously into a number of solutions, or whatever they find that they fits them best and where they stand.
Yeah. Thank you all for sharing. I know it's not the easiest question to answer. So now we are going to open the floor to all of you and to everybody online as well. So you can use the menti.com platform to submit questions, and I've got them all up here. You can also upvote questions that you are like, ooh, they already submitted that one. I like this one. So if you're joining us online, or if that's how you would prefer to submit your questions, you are welcome to do so that way. If you're in the audience, we'd love to hear your voice. So if you would like to ask a question yourself, if you could head down to this side of the stage over here, it's my right, so it's your left, and you can ask your questions. We just ask that you please use the microphone so that anybody who's viewing online can hear those questions as well. And we'll kind of switch back and forth between someone at the mic up front and the questions that are coming in online. But yeah, if you'd like to go first.
Yes. Since the military seemed to draw a lot of aviation technology forward, where do you see the military and the Air Force coming into these synthetic fuels and the future of those guys driving some innovation?
Yeah, so great question. So the military, again, I was a very short period of time, I was in the United States Navy. My experience with the military is they have a very different mission than anything else that we are talking about on this panel. And their mission is defend the nation states. So I think while sustainability is a big part of the conversation, I think the military is looking for assets that can help them achieve that mission, with sustainability perhaps as an afterthought. And I would suspect that they probably don't know, and I'm sure there'll be tons of things in the comments after we end this discussion about the military. But look, they're going to have their own individuals that are researching this significantly, rather than a public space that would be researching that. But that's just my own, and I'm hoping Dominic might have some comments about that as well. But
Yeah, well, let's say they may have a similar goal, but it's not necessarily for the same reason. They want fuel efficiency, not because, I mean, hopefully they care a little bit about the climate and things like that, but because that's every time it is a major logistical challenge, right? If you have a tank, if you have a plane that is a huge gas guzzler, you need to ship this fuel to these bases to get these things moving. So it is a big challenge, and so we see there's actually in the ground transport a lot of research on making, more efficient trucks, more efficient tanks. On the aviation side, I would say probably where we're going to see is that the trend to go smaller and using these eVTOL technologies that we mentioned, these air taxis, they're actually also of great interest to the military. And I think the Joby, for example, probably first customer is not going to be a passenger, but it's going to be the military. That opens the field to some other new forms of missions, drones, of course, and the longer they can fly with the smaller infrastructure, easier supply on the ground, the better it is for their mission. So there's shared objectives in a way with the civilian world.
I also think it's important to remember too, there is a host of technologies that we enjoy every day that were byproducts of a DARPA paper or DARPA technology, microwave technology, GPS. All of these were residual technologies that we enjoy every day that were byproducts of military research. So, I don't want to say that they're not doing sustainability because it's good for the environment. I think that their research often is an offshoot of a benefit for society rather than a direct research that would benefit us.
Cool. We're going to go here, and then we'll do a couple online.
Thank you very much for giving the talk. I really appreciate it. It was very insightful. I guess maybe two questions. One is quick for the SAF gentleman. Just for my understanding, I guess, to kind of understand like carbon emissions and like offsetting, getting us to kind of sustainability, that jumping off point, would that require carbon emissions like I guess fossil fuels or I guess traditional fuels that in order to get us in that kind of trajectory? Is that kind of my understanding? Does that make sense? Not sure if that question makes sense.
I think what you're trying to ask, if I understand correctly, is how much do we need to do so that it matters, right? Or
Yeah, correct, yeah.
or how far are we from just making the entire aviation industry carbon neutral, right?
Yeah, kind of the first one, yeah.
More or less hitting. Okay.
Yeah.
You bring a good point of how do we measure sustainability? That's a complete challenge, a separate challenge that requires a completely specific kind of science, right? So there is a lot of work being done on the methods. How do we account for carbon? Because it has to be looked at holistically, and it's somewhat subjective, unfortunately. So the way to look at it more objectively, it's life cycle analysis. So from the source to the end use impacts of carbon. And in that subject, I think it's important to mention that to some people, the emissions only matter at point source. So if from your vehicle, maybe you care about what your vehicle does, but other people are looking at it a little more holistically. Even the source of what's driving your vehicle now. So if it's an electric vehicle, where did that battery come from, and the impacts of making that battery also play a role. So first of all, I like to look at it like that. So it's the entire life cycle of how do you get your energy for your vehicle or your airplane. And then once you do that, then you have to solve those problems one by one in order to get to where you need to be. And one of those things may be that the end user just feels better about it, right? But a more serious goal is the type of goals that the governments are setting of net neutrality, right? That's a big challenge, right? And that's going to take a lot more effort than simply appeasing the public, right? So that's a complicated conversation, I think, to address right now. But yes, so the answer is that it takes a lot of science from a multitude of different disciplines in order to solve these kinds of problems. So it involves the scientists that work on the front end of things like I am, people on the back end of things, people designing the right vehicles, and then some people accounting properly for all of that, all those impacts.
May I ask sorry about the double question. So as we're seeing like kind of innovation progress, and we're seeing like AI is the new hotness, as the panelists mentioned, we have a wealth of testing and history of results of, okay, what happens when I do this? We get the result. Where can we see kind of AI kind of chug into all of this and kind of give us this data-driven kind of, formulaic, okay, magical black box of like, okay, how can this kind of accelerate our testing as like a tool to help us?
So maybe I'll give an example of not directly aviation, but more focused on batteries. There at Argonne, I have colleagues that use AI to basically automate the process of exploring new materials for battery. Right, in batteries you need to test a lot of different things, and it also applies to drugs and other fields. And having AI enables you to more quickly identify candidates, and they can actually sometimes even get to the level where they even, AI just things on computers, but then they can translate that into also automating some of the experiments, running the experiments and getting back into the training algorithm. So that's a big initiative in the AI fields, especially in our national labs, on how to use AI to push the boundaries of sciences, of manufacturing, of experimentation. So that's one way, and I hope maybe this is how we'll get to these magical batteries that will be much more efficient.
Okay, thank you very much.
We'll take a question from online, which is me, so one moment. The top question we have is, what can we as not in this industry do in the short term to support sustainable aviation, right?
Yeah, these are fascinating and hard questions. Airlines have tried simple things, and even bus companies now, pay $4 extra for net neutrality. And it's somewhat symbolic in that, as you point out, we think it's hard to measure the environmental impacts of producing SAF. Try modeling the Brazilian rainforest. I mean, it's just really hard to know, but it's a step in the positive direction that people can see what those carbon impacts are. And now getting them to act on smart decisions, I think, is still going to take those incentives. It's interesting, American Airlines and United just are now partnering with a ground provider called Landline, which is a bus company, and they've shifted a number of really short flights to buses. Example being Philadelphia to Scranton or Philadelphia to Atlantic City. And they tested people's reaction. And they found if they pitched it as convenience, that didn't really sell. But if they pitched it as you're also helping the environment, people connect with it. So I see consumers voting with their wallet being an extremely powerful tool, even if it's only at the margin on these really smaller things. And I think airlines get graded by their environmental scores now, so there's press on how well you're doing, who's first and who's last. Amazon has a massive image problem, and they've hired a team of dream scientists to try to make themselves more sustainable because they saw people were demanding it, and they as a company felt responsible. So making noise about a company's carbon footprint really is effective.
Yeah, those are great comments, by the way, to what Joe just said too, because that's really what I've been seeing is that, when people are voting essentially with their pocketbook. I mean, if they're going to fly a company that's being sustainable as a choice, that really is a very easy way to advocate in the short term. But yeah, I would submit the other thing is that, you're seeing a lot of airlines that are also, you would be hard pressed to find an airline that does not have a chief sustainability officer. So just that position alone is pretty emblematic that they have a staff, that they have a team that are working on these issues and if they're working these issues, that means they're lobbying the government. So yeah, if you continue to utilize companies that are in the sustainability space and that are being successful at it, I think that's a really strong way of supporting it.
So the next question we have is, are some cities better suited for different types of sustainable aviation? So we've talked about like a lot of different types. Are some cities better suited than others for, say, air taxis versus sustainable air fuel versus other options?
I'll take a whack at that. I think you look at certain city pairs, like we in the United States don't have any 747s flying domestically, I don't think. In Japan, that's still a very common thing. The markets are so dense, they're so thick, that the kind of planes they use there are very large. The ability to electrify that is a long way off to have, that kind of volume. But you look at rural markets, and you can see these technologies really can play a role quite fast. So we had no commercial scheduled helicopter service in the United States for several decades. And now that technology's popped up again. New York has airport service by a company called Blade. Canada has it from Vancouver to Victoria, commercial service. So in urban environments, these really small planes, vertical takeoff and landing, and rural areas where the density is so light that you just can't justify bigger planes, are going to be kind of two sweet spots for that technology. But the larger markets with big volume aircraft, unfortunately, I think that's the hardest thing to electrify, and waiting for hydrogen may be important for that.
Yeah, those are great comments too. The helicopter question has always been a very difficult one because helicopters are incredibly expensive to operate. But if you can justify the rationale for having it monetarily, and I think New York is a great example, because you've got a lot of people that live out in Long Island that are willing to pay that commodity to fly I don't know, what is it, 20? Yeah, right, to fly there to JFK or to fly to their building, downtown. They will pay that price just for the convenience. So you're seeing a lot of these urban air mobility companies that are starting to move into, they've already been approved, I think, in New York. And then also the states and the cities all have a stake in whether they want to be a part of this. So, if you want your city or your where you live to be a part of this, oftentimes voting and oftentimes petitioning people to be part of these test beds. Chicago has not been an incredibly helicopter-friendly city for many, many years, where LA has been a huge supporter of helicopter technology. So I'm wondering, it's very curious, because we're in a sort of a test bed period to see which one of these technologies and which city is it really going to take hold of. But if I had to guess, if it's just a guess, I would guess that people that are fairly wealthy are going to be the ones that are utilizing this technology first. And then the price point of that is going to get driven down, which then will allow people like us to be able to utilize it.
I'll just add something. You said something interesting. I love your comments about this. So this United Service would likely use the vertiport at the Lower Medical District, which was specifically built to be set up for this new vertical takeoff and landing equipment. But we've been a very helicopter-unfriendly town. Meigs Field comes down, no replacement. Midway Airport isn't really usable for that. So we're an odd place to be seeing a renaissance. Would you agree with that?
I would.
Yeah.
Cool. We've got a question from the audience.
Hi, thank you so much for coming in today. This is really interesting and informative. I'm not in your field, but it's really cool to hear you talk. You had mentioned that technologies exist for a long time before something happens that brings them into general use, for example, video conferencing. The theory for that has existed for a very long time. It took COVID to bring that into everybody's lives. We saw that with mRNA vaccines. We needed COVID to come by and incentivize the investment and energy to focus on actually actioning on that theory. We also saw it with AI, as someone mentioned before. Theory for natural language models has existed since the 70s, but having a UI is less catastrophic than COVID, but having a UI that everybody could use suddenly kicked all of this into motion in the rest of our lives. So I'm wondering, short of a climate catastrophe of scales that we can't imagine right now, are there catalysts, maybe policy or otherwise, that we can use to intentionally kick off or accelerate this process? I'm thinking policy maybe at an intergovernmental level, but then you have the carrot and the stick problem with your individual governments, or maybe in your fields you have something beyond policy, maybe something social. Yes, thank you.
I'll start. A really great question. I was at a session in Europe last year, and they said that exact same thing. For us to have a carbon tax, we got to get every country to do it, because if Germany does it, Lufthansa will be hurt versus some other country that doesn't have it, because every flight, they fuel there and so forth. So it really is a coordination problem. I am really excited, and I hate to say taxes, but some carbon incentives are really exciting to me. With every time people are at their computer, should I take this vacation or that one, the train or the bus or the plane? There is some incentive there to do that. California is playing with that, with their carbon tax. We'll see how that goes. Early results are fairly promising, but we're not a country that's looking for taxes right now with the economy softening. I do think something will break, I say that in an exciting way, with electric technology, that we never know how these paths are going to take. I mean, people envision, say, electric cars. We're suddenly all going to be driving electric cars in 20 years. That might be true, but there could be some pivot in that technology that we're not quite aware of yet, where the cars could become very much smaller, or we could have transit fleets be fully electric quicker than we think. And so I think moving up that technology learning curve and not thinking you know what the future is going to look like, because we will be surprised. In aviation, you mentioned the battery breakthrough, that we get a 10-fold increase in power per pound of battery, could completely change the game. I hope in my lifetime we see that.
Well, again, I really like the question. I really like the word that you used, and the word was catalyst. What is that catalyst going to be? So there's an acute catalyst, right? Something that would happen that would precipitate a significant change, right? I'm not going to speculate on what that might be or what could potentially happen, because nobody could have predicted that COVID would have the repercussions that it did. However, being the age that I am incredibly encouraged by the work that young people are doing right now. And what I mean by that is you are laser focused on this issue in a way that people that are of my generation are not and have not been. So there's always this tipping point, right, with any technology. And I think all of us has done a really good job. My colleagues have done a really great job of talking about that. What's that tipping point going to be? Whether it's all of a sudden urban air mobility is cool and everybody is willing to pay a higher tax, if you will, or a higher cost per unit to fly on an urban air mobility, or some sort of cultural incident, cultural adopting of something that happens. And again, I can't speculate on what that cultural issue would be, but I'll tell you, the work that a lot of the young people are doing on my campus, other campuses around the Chicagoland area, we see it nationally. I know Joe travels internationally as well. But look, you're not letting any people that are from my generation off the hook. You just aren't. It is every 5 or 6 questions in my classroom. You're hyper focused on this issue as well as you should be. And my hope is that you guys will continue your efforts and continue to hold us accountable. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a question online, and then I think we've got another one in the audience. So this is a little bit of a different angle. How can sustainable air technology keep air travel accessible to communities across the socioeconomic spectrum?
You know, the cost of air travel, and my students don't often accept this view until I show them the data. The cost of air travel is just coming down so consistently and rapidly. Even post-pandemic, we're seeing these ultra-low-cost carriers just bring the cost down. The big carriers introduce basic economy to compete with them. So air travel has become much more democratic, if you will. So I don't think the industry is super vulnerable to becoming exclusionary to low-income groups. But the data does show when you drive up costs, in the short term, the low-income groups suffer the most because they have the fewer alternatives and so forth. I think the exciting thing about some policies is they're being accompanied by a concept called mobility as a right. Everybody should have the ability to travel. So it's our job as a government to give everybody mobility. It doesn't necessarily mean flying, but we have a ground transportation system that can get you anywhere. And when you set that base, then air travel is just one piece of the puzzle, and we're not trying to fix everything just with a very carbon-intensive mode.
Yeah. Can I really quick? I'm going to hold off.
Great question.
It's a good question, though. I'm going to hold off.
Sure. So when you guys first started talking about urban transportation as a platform for these underdeveloped energy sources that aren't quite as efficient yet, such as like electrified air transit or like hydrogen fuel cells, which I guess are also electrified. I would admit that like my first reaction is somewhat pessimistic as like these being the road to sustainability. But I guess for the sake of optimism, which it seems like you all are excited about improving the sustainability of air transit, what are some examples as experts with historical knowledge in your fields that we should look to say, hey, these upfront investments might seem drastically inefficient. They might seem to only benefit the wealthy or people who are not the masses, but look, over time, we put the effort in and they actually led to fruitful results.
Maybe we could look a little bit at EVs, right, for just cars, they started, and they're still to a certain extent are quite expensive, right? So the idea here, at least on the automotive, is to get the industry is investing massive amounts of money, and they want to get some of that money back, so they're trying to sell very expensive cars because that's where they get the margins that are enough to sustain these investments. And sometimes you see things like ginormous trucks that are EVs. They're not exactly the most sustainable ways to move around, even if they're electric. But that kind of down the line, the industry develops and may be able to propose solutions that are more affordable and to a larger number of people. So maybe that could be an example, although it's a very good point that there's a lot of, you go towards one direction, oh, it's great, right? It solves all the problems, and then you discover all the things around it and like all the negative effects, things that people, I think they knew about it, but just like ignore them, and it's a tough question in a lot of these engineering problems.
I'll try to comment without putting too much of my own opinion, but as a scientist or as an engineer, the goal is to be able to not change the costs of travel too much, right? So I mentioned the cost parity with the incumbent fuel is part of the goal. I mean, if we can make it cheaper, even better. But the goal is not to influence that, not to create a problem where it's not only exclusive access to sustainable products, but to the public in general. So that answers at least a part of that question that I was interested in. But the other part has to do with impacts. And of course, when we talk about sustainability and greenhouse gas, these are more global problems, but there's also local problems that I am trying to address, and my company are trying to address. One of those examples has to do with the communities, right? So we're not just talking about greenhouse gas, but we're talking about things that can impact communities directly or indirectly from air travel. One is noise pollution, right, or air quality. So these questions all become important to address as well, and of course, it's part of what we're trying to do. But yeah, so the other aspect of this is that as we build up a new economy around, say, SAF, part of the goal is to create jobs as well. So not just to make air travel cleaner and affordable, but also there's other benefits that come with that, that have to do with who's gonna work to produce these fuels, or who's gonna build these new airplanes and these new engines. We need a workforce that's well trained, that can come in and do that work when it's needed, but also these jobs are being created. So there's benefits across the board when it comes to innovation that not just apply to this, but apply to a lot of the other things that we're trying to work on.
Yeah, and Pedro brings up a great point, and I think this was helpful for me to understand how complex this issue is. We don't have any way to store any of the technologies these guys are making. Hydrogen is an incredibly, I know these guys are working, but hydrogen is an incredibly volatile substance. Like we just can't make a fuel cell that's going to hold that at 45,000 feet under lots of different temperatures. We don't even know how to put, like, all the infrastructure we have for these fuels have gone through hundreds of years of development. So, and I'm mindful of this because I drive through, there's a oil refinery by where I drive through on my way to campus. And when I drive by that, I'm like, wow, there's so much infrastructure and safety built around this that it's taken decades and decades to build that up. And now we have to do this in a much more transformative way. But I want to, the other thing that you mentioned was about the wealth gap, right? The wealth of somebody to utilize these technologies, and how do we keep that? Joe said something really remarkable, and that is, like, I worked for Southwest Airlines for many years, and I remember getting emails and $39 to fly from point A to point B. I'm like, how can they possibly do that? Like, how can they do that? Like, they must be losing money on all these flights. They're not. They're able to do it at a very high volume, safely, efficiently, with minimum services. That's how they're doing it. And it is remarkably effective. To put that genie back in the bottle and say that you're not going to be able to fly anymore for the masses, I think is a little unrealistic. I think that market has been opened up and it's not going back. So the ability for people to travel with varied socioeconomic abilities or capabilities, I think has been penetrated. Now, the market for people to, my hope is that the market for people to fly sustainably in aviation, that will be a policy issue. My guess is that will be a government issue for them to compel airlines to be able to operate at this very, very efficient level.
Thank you.
All right, so it is basically at time. Thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate you. Thank you everyone at C2ST, the Harold Washington Library, all of our speakers. Let's give them a round of applause. And thank you all for coming out tonight. And if you're watching online, thank you for tuning in. We would love your feedback about the program, about this, what you learned today. So if you're here in the room, we handed out some paper surveys. If you could just fill out, there are some pens at the table outside if you don't have a pen. We just really appreciate your feedback to know what you want to learn more about, what's working for you, what isn't. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to everyone who helped make this event happen, and everyone get home safely.
Thank you all.
Nice job, Joe.
Thank you all.